Unanimous consent to speak for up to 30 minutes prior to the scheduled roll call vote. I do not think I will need it, but out of an abundance of caution, I ask unanimous consent for that, please.
Without objection.
All right. I do appreciate Senator Kane's remarks. He has highlighted a serious problem for many Americans. We don't completely understand it. I have every confidence in our medical community and our research and development community that we will figure it out. But in the meantime, there are a lot of Americans suffering, some silently, and I appreciate Senator Kane highlighting this issue. I want to talk for a few minutes, Mr. President, about President Biden's bailout of the three banks that went under. When I ran for this office in 2016, I observed at that time that one of the problems in America was that we had too many undeserving. I emphasize undeserving because I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush. We had too many undeserving people at the top in America getting bailouts. And we had too many undeserving people at the bottom getting handouts. And the rest of America, most of America in the middle, was getting the bill. And I didn't think that was fair. And apparently it's still the case today, Mr. President, and I still don't think it's fair. Now, President Biden chose to bail out three of our banks. It was a bailout. You can pretty it up any way you want to. And you can put perfume on a pig, but it still smells like a pig. This was a bailout. It was a bailout for two reasons. Number one, except for the people who own the stock in the banks and their unsecured creditors, President Biden and his regulators guaranteed that nobody affiliated with these banks would have any losses. And he said, that's not a bailout because money's not being provided by the American people. It's being provided by all the other banks in America. Well, Mr. President, as you know as well as I do, there is no money fairy. There isn't anything free. Anything free, somebody had to work for it. By taking the hit, all the banks in America now, I'm referring to, banks are taxpayers, that's point one. Point two, but those banks, all the banks in America that are going to have to pay for the president's bailout, they're just going to pass on those costs, including but not limited to their depositors. And last time I checked, most depositors in banks in America were taxpayers as well. The second reason President Biden's bailout is a bailout, and this is in the fine print, but he has set up I think it's a $25 billion fund that other banks that are in trouble can borrow from. And this fund, he says, does not come from the American people. It came from the banks. Once again, the costs of it will be passed on by the banks to the depositors, to the taxpayers. But this $25 billion fund that banks that are in trouble can borrow from is set up as follows. The banks can borrow money as they need it, and as collateral, they put up their securities. So the president says that's a safe bet. Except when you read the fine print, you find out that the securities that the banks put up as collateral to borrow money from the American people are not what's called mark-to-market. They aren't, the securities are not put up at their real value. They're put up at the value for what at the time they were purchased. So if you bought a security that was, let's say, to make it simple, $20 and it's owned by a bank, and it's now worth $5. You give that $5 to the $25 billion fund, but it's really, and you get credit for $10, but it's really worth only $5. I mean, it's a bailout. And I'm not going to bubble wrap it, and I don't think we ought to try to bubble wrap it to the American people. Now, let me say a word about Silicon Valley Bank. All the bank failures were an abomination, but I think Silicon Valley Bank is symptomatic of the problem among all three. SVB, as we call it, Silicon Valley Bank. First of all, Silicon Valley Bank was not broke. It was not an insolvency problem. It wasn't insolvent. Silicon Valley Bank had a liquidity problem. I mean, here's what happened. Silicon Valley Bank took in a whole bunch of deposits on which they were paying an interest rate. And then Silicon Valley Bank took that money and went out and bought a bunch of securities, paying a higher interest rate than Silicon Valley Bank was paying the depositors. You say, that's pretty smart. There's just one problem. The securities that Silicon Valley Bank bought were very sensitive to interest rates. And as interest rates went up, and they have, the value of those securities went down if Silicon Valley Bank had to sell them. And sure enough, Silicon Valley Bank got itself in the position of having to sell them because a lot of its depositors got scared about the bank's position and other reasons and said, we want our money back. And Silicon Valley Bank didn't have the money because it had to go sell these securities at a loss. And that put it at risk. And that's why it had a liquidity problem that could have been fixed. It wasn't broke. President Biden's bailout could have been easily avoided if we had done, let me put that another way, if three things had happened. Not all three, but any one of the three things I'm about to explain. Let me say that again. President Biden's bailout could have been avoided if one or more of three things had happened. Number one, if the management of Silicon Valley Bank had known the difference between a banking textbook and an LL Bean catalog, Silicon Valley Bank would have never bought securities that are so sensitive to interest rate without hedging that risk. And it's a very easy thing to do. Honestly, it's banking 101. If you buy securities to back your deposits that are very sensitive to interest rates, there are other securities you can buy to hedge that risk so you don't take the risk. I'm appalled. The bankers at Silicon Valley Bank didn't do it. I mean, it was bone deep, down to the marrow, stupid. Number two, okay, Silicon Valley Bank management did it. It was like a rock, only dumber, but they did it. The regulators didn't catch it. There's been a lot of talk about Silicon Valley Bank wasn't being regulated because of a bill passed back in 2018 or 2019. That's not true. Silicon Valley Bank was heavily regulated. It had to file regular reports with the federal banking regulators. It was subject to stress testing. It was subject to liquidity stress testing. All the regulators had to do was read the reports that the Silicon Valley Bank was submitting, and they would have seen the problem. You know who saw the problem? Way back in November and October, stock analysts in the private sector that were covering Silicon Valley Bank warned way back last fall. They said, you know what, this bank is setting itself up for a potential liquidity problem. The private sector knew it. Where were the regulators? Where were they? You couldn't have found them with a search party. I guess they were asleep. But this whole debacle could have been avoided if the regulators had just done their job and stepped in and said, Silicon Valley Bank, what you're doing is dumb and you can't do it anymore. So that would have avoided. The third thing that could have avoided President Biden's bailout, I think the bank went under on a Friday, as I recall. The Federal Reserve, the Secretary of Treasury, the head of the FDIC, and all the other regulators allowed the bank to go under. Instead of getting on the telephone and calling other banks and saying, I've got a situation here with Silicon Valley Bank, it's not insolvent, it's just illiquid, we want you to buy it. That's what normally happens. And that's all the regulators had to do. Now, why didn't they do that? There's been a lot of talk about, well, they had an auction for the bank and nobody wanted it. That's not true. There were buyers. But the problem was that the people at the FDIC do not like bank mergers. Some bank mergers make sense. Some bank mergers don't make sense. In this case, it would have made extraordinary sense. And so the folks at the FDIC stalled and restalled, and then we had mass panic. Think back to the bailouts in 08 and 09. If you're a banker and you get a call from the Secretary of Treasury, the head of the Federal Reserve, and the head of the FDIC saying, can we sit down and talk with you and structure the terms by which you would buy this illiquid but still solvent bank, you're going to take that phone call. And the regulators didn't do that. And all of this could have been avoided. So if we had done any one of those three things, this mess could have been avoided. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With that, let me just make one last comment. I'm going to say it again. In 2016, in America, we had too many undeserving people at the top getting bailouts. And we still do today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.